It was late in the evening when the sun had almost disappeared behind the tall buildings of a quiet suburban town. The streets were calm with only a few cars passing by. A light wind brushed against the trees as a black SUV moved steadily down the road. Inside the vehicle sat a man in uniform, an Army Lieutenant General returning home after a long day of official work. His face showed calmness and discipline, the kind that comes from years of service and responsibility. He had just left the military base after attending a meeting and was looking forward to some rest. His car was clean, the windows slightly rolled down to let in the cool air. The soft hum of the engine filled the silence, and the general's thoughts wandered toward his family, his home, and the dinner that might be waiting for him. But that calmness didn't last long. From behind, flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared. The sound of a police siren echoed through the empty street. The general looked in the rearview mirror, slightly surprised. He was driving under the speed limit, had his seatbelt on, and hadn't violated any traffic rules. Still, he pulled over to the side of the road as any law-abiding person would do. The police car came to a stop behind him, and the siren went silent. For a few seconds, the general waited, expecting the officer to approach calmly, but what followed was far from calm. The officer's door opened hard, hitting the air with a sharp sound. A tall man stepped out wearing dark sunglasses even though the sun had almost set. His steps were quick and aggressive, his hand already near his holster. The general noticed it through his side mirror. The officer's movements were filled with suspicion and tension, as if he were approaching a dangerous criminal. The general rolled his window all the way down, resting both hands on the steering wheel, where they could be clearly seen. He knew how important that was during a traffic stop. With years of training in leadership and discipline, he believed in calm communication, but as the officer reached the window, his tone was rough from the very first word. "License and registration," the officer barked. The general nodded politely and replied, "Of course, officer. May I ask the reason for the stop?" Instead of answering, the officer's expression hardened. "I'll tell you that after I see your documents," he said sharply, leaning closer as if trying to find a reason to be suspicious. The general, keeping his movements slow, reached into the glove compartment and handed over his license and vehicle registration. The officer looked at the documents, but didn't seem satisfied. His tone grew colder. "Where are you coming from?" he demanded. "From the nearby military base," the general answered calmly. "I serve as an officer there." The officer gave a short, sarcastic laugh. "An officer, huh? We'll see about that." His eyes narrowed as he looked over the uniform visible on the general's seat. "You people always have some story, don't you?" The general was taken aback by the tone but didn't respond harshly. He chose to remain composed. "Sir, I'm just returning home after my duty. I'm sure there must be some misunderstanding." Instead of calming down, the officer took a step back and placed his hand firmly on his holstered weapon. The general noticed the movement but remained still. "Stay right where you are," the officer shouted suddenly, loud enough for the nearby houses to hear. The general froze, both hands still on the wheel. "Officer, I'm not moving," he said gently, keeping his voice steady. "You can check my ID, it confirms my position." But the officer didn't check anything. His behavior grew more unpredictable. His eyes flicked between the ID and the general, his jaw tight. "Don't tell me what to do," he snapped. "Step out of the vehicle, now." The general hesitated for a moment. The situation didn't make sense. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was being treated as a threat. Still, to avoid escalation, he followed the order. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible at all times. The cool night air touched his face, but tension hung heavily in the air. The officer's hand moved even closer to his gun. His face was stiff, his voice harsh. "Put your hands where I can see them." "They are right here," the general said softly, lifting them slightly higher. "You don't need to worry, officer. I'm cooperating." But cooperation didn't seem to matter. The officer circled around the SUV, his flashlight shining into the car, into the general's face, and even onto the ground, as if searching for something to justify his aggression. He asked questions rapidly: where he lived, why he was out so late, who owned the vehicle. The general answered each one politely, his patience tested but unbroken. Inside the general's chest, his heart beat faster, not out of fear for himself, but for how easily an ordinary situation was turning into something dangerous. His years of service had taught him to face crises calmly, but this was different. He wasn't in a battlefield or a command post. He was just a citizen being treated unfairly. As the officer continued to question him, another car slowed down at a distance. A driver noticed what was happening and started recording on a phone. The general noticed but didn't react. He focused on staying calm, hoping the situation would soon de-escalate. The officer, however, seemed to grow more irritated, as if the calmness of the man in front of him made him angrier. "You think you're better than me because of that uniform?" he sneered. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" The general shook his head slightly. "No, sir. I'm simply asking for respect and fairness." The words hung in the air, heavy and clear. For a moment there was silence. Then the officer exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. He paced around the SUV again, muttering under his breath. A few moments later he reached for his radio and spoke quickly, though his words were not clear. The general stood still beside his car, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The flashing lights reflected off the SUV's surface, making the scene appear almost surreal. Minutes passed, but they felt longer. The general thought of his service, the long nights overseas, the missions, the responsibility of leading hundreds of soldiers. And now, standing here, he realized how powerless he felt in this moment, not because of the officer's authority, but because of his misuse of it. Finally, the officer returned, still holding the documents. "You wait here," he ordered. "I'm going to check this through." He walked back to his patrol car, leaving the general standing alone by the side of the road. The sound of distant traffic filled the silence again. The general took a deep breath, glancing briefly at the stars above. He thought about how quickly peace could turn into chaos, how a simple misunderstanding, or worse, prejudice, could lead to unnecessary conflict. From the police car, the officer's voice could be heard faintly through the open window. He was speaking into his radio, though his words were mixed with frustration. The general remained still, refusing to let anger or fear control his actions. After several long minutes, the officer returned, looking no calmer than before. He tossed the documents back into the general's hands and said, "You can go." There was no apology, no explanation, only a cold glare. The general looked at him quietly. "Is there anything wrong with my documents, officer?" "No," the officer replied curtly. "But next time, watch where you drive." The general gave a slight nod. "Understood." He got back into his SUV, closed the door, and waited for a moment before driving off. His hands were steady, but his heart was heavy. As he drove away, he couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. It wasn't just about him. It was about what it represented. A man who had given his life to protect his country had been treated like a criminal for no reason other than suspicion and bias. He didn't want revenge, but he wanted truth and accountability. The streetlights passed one by one as his SUV disappeared into the night. Behind him, the police car still sat under the flickering lights, a silent reminder of the encounter that would soon come to light and stir conversations across the town. That night, the general knew something deeper had been set in motion. What began as a simple traffic stop had uncovered something far more serious, something that would soon make headlines and spark change in ways no one had expected. The next morning came quietly, but the tension from the previous night still lingered in the air. The Army Lieutenant General woke up early, as he always did. Routine was part of his life. He made his bed neatly, fixed his uniform for the day, and prepared a cup of coffee. But his thoughts weren't calm. They kept circling back to the moment when that officer had shouted at him, the way he was treated, and the anger hidden behind those words. He had faced danger before, on missions, in war zones, in unpredictable places where fear was real. But what happened last night felt different. It wasn't fear that bothered him. It was the deep sense of injustice. How could someone in uniform, someone who had sworn to protect others, act with so much hostility toward another person, especially one who had done nothing wrong? He sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee slowly. Outside, the morning sun brightened the neighborhood, but inside his heart, a quiet storm was brewing. His phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from one of his colleagues at the base. The message read, "Sir, there's a video going around. It looks like you." He frowned slightly and opened the link. What he saw made his stomach tighten. The video showed last night's traffic stop. A bystander had recorded the entire incident. It was clear and steady, The flashing police lights, the officer's raised voice, the calm replies from the general. Every word was captured. Every bit of aggression was visible. Within minutes, he realized the video had already gained attention. Comments were pouring in, some filled with shock, others with anger. People were demanding answers. Some recognized his uniform and were expressing disbelief that a man of such rank and respect could be treated that way. He turned off the phone and leaned back in his chair. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or concerned. On one hand, the truth was out. On the other, the situation was now public, and public attention could be unpredictable. Later that morning, he received a call from the military base. The voice on the other end was calm but serious. "Sir, we've seen the footage. The higher-ups are aware. Are you all right?" "Yes," he replied simply. "Physically, I'm fine." "Good," the officer said. "There's going to be an internal discussion about this. The local police department will be under review. Please keep yourself available for any statements." After the call ended, he sat quietly for a long time. He knew this was bigger than him now. What happened on that empty street was no longer just a personal experience. It had become a matter of accountability. Meanwhile, across town, the same police officer who had stopped him the night before arrived at the station. He walked through the doors as usual, holding his coffee, his expression unreadable. But the station was unusually quiet. A few officers looked up from their desks. Their expressions weren't friendly. Something had changed. When he reached his desk, his supervisor called out his name sharply. "Office now." The officer followed without a word. Inside, the supervisor's face was stern. A file sat on the desk, open, with a printed screenshot from the viral video. "You want to tell me what this is?" the supervisor asked, tapping the image. The officer shrugged. "Routine stop. Guy was acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" The supervisor raised an eyebrow. "He's a lieutenant general in the army. You had no valid reason to stop him. You pointed a weapon at him and used disrespectful language. The whole thing is online. It's embarrassing, for the department and for the city." The officer shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't cooperating. "That's not what the video shows," the supervisor said coldly. He was calm. "You were the one shouting. We're opening a full investigation. For now, you're on administrative leave." The officer's jaw tightened. "You can't be serious." "I am," the supervisor replied firmly. "Hand over your badge and weapon." The officer hesitated but eventually obeyed. The sound of his badge hitting the desk echoed in the small office. As he left the room, the weight of his decisions finally began to settle in. Back at the base, the general attended a scheduled briefing, though his mind was elsewhere. During a short break, one of the younger soldiers approached him quietly. "Sir, I just wanted to say, we all saw what happened. You handled it with real dignity." The general gave a small, appreciative nod. "Thank you," he said. "But this shouldn't happen to anyone." "Not to me, not to anyone else," the soldier nodded. "Yes, sir. People are talking about it everywhere. Even the local news picked it up." Indeed, by the afternoon, local news stations had begun running the story. The headline appeared on screens. "Army General threatened during traffic stop. Officer under investigation." Reporters discussed the situation respectfully, but the footage spoke louder than any commentary. The internet had already spread it far and wide. In the evening, the general received another call, this time from a senior military official. The voice on the line carried authority but also concern. "I saw the footage," the official said. "It's unacceptable. The department is already facing pressure from the public. The mayor's office wants answers fast." "I understand," the general said. "I don't want this to turn into anger or hate. I only want accountability and change." "That's the right approach," the voice replied. "And that's why your calmness means something right now. The way you handled yourself sets an example." That night, the general sat outside on his porch, the cool breeze brushing against his face. He watched the street, now peaceful and quiet, the same street where it all happened. His thoughts were heavy but steady. He believed that what was done in darkness always came to light, and perhaps this incident would remind people of that truth. At the police station, the atmosphere grew more tense by the hour. Reporters had gathered outside asking questions the department wasn't ready to answer. Inside, officers whispered among themselves. Some defended their colleague quietly. Others were deeply ashamed. The chief of police held a meeting that evening to address the situation directly. "We cannot ignore what happened," the chief said. his tone serious. This department stands for fairness and respect. What we saw in that video does not represent who we are. An investigation is already underway and the officer involved has been placed on leave. If the evidence confirms misconduct, appropriate action will be taken immediately. The officers in the room listened silently. No one argued. Everyone knew the truth was clear. Meanwhile, the general's story reached beyond the town. News outlets from nearby cities picked it up. Social media platforms were filled with messages of support for him and calls for justice. Many veterans, current soldiers, and citizens began sharing their thoughts, saying that such treatment toward anyone, especially someone who served his country, was unacceptable. Despite the growing attention, the general chose to stay quiet publicly. He didn't post statements or give interviews. He preferred to let the investigation take its course. But privately, he hoped this would become a lesson for others, not just about one incident, but about the need for respect, humanity, and accountability in every profession. A few days later, investigators arrived at the police department to review body camera footage. The recordings showed exactly what everyone had already seen: the officer's raised voice, the drawn weapon, the disrespectful remarks, and the calm response from the general. There was no room for excuses. By the end of the week, a report was sent to the city's administration. It was detailed, direct, and firm. The findings were undeniable. The officer had violated department policy, acted with unnecessary aggression, and showed clear bias in his behavior. The general received a formal call informing him of the results. "The report is complete," the investigator said. "They found the officer at fault. The chief will be making an announcement soon." "Thank you," the general replied. His tone was calm, but inside he felt a small wave of relief. Justice was beginning to take shape. Later that evening, he sat with his family. His wife, who had been quietly worried since the incident, looked at him and said, "I'm proud of how you handled everything." He smiled faintly. "I just did what I thought was right. Losing my temper would have only made things worse." She nodded. "Still, it's unfair that you had to go through that." He looked at her gently. "Yes, it is. But sometimes moments like this remind people of what still needs to change. If that happens, maybe it's worth it." The house was quiet for a moment. Then his phone buzzed again. Another notification, another headline, another wave of support from people he had never met. It was overwhelming, but it also showed that kindness and fairness still existed. As the night deepened, he stood by the window, looking out at the silent street once more. Somewhere out there, the officer who had treated him so poorly was probably thinking about what he had done, and maybe, just maybe, he was realizing the weight of his actions. For the general, it wasn't about revenge. It was about integrity. He believed that doing the right thing, even in moments of injustice, would always lead to something good. And though this chapter of his life had begun with anger and disrespect, he hoped it would end with understanding and change for everyone involved. The following morning, the city woke up to more than just another news story. It woke up to a discussion that was spreading everywhere, at breakfast tables, in offices, at schools, and online. The video from the traffic stop had gone viral, and everyone had an opinion. Some people were shocked that such behavior could happen in their town, while others said it was long overdue for the truth to come out. The Army Lieutenant General tried to go about his morning as usual. He woke up before sunrise, did his usual short walk around the block, and prepared his uniform neatly. But as soon as he opened his phone, he could see how big things had become overnight. News outlets from across the country were now covering the story. His picture was being shown everywhere, and the words "calm under pressure" were repeated again and again. He turned off his phone and took a deep breath. Fame was not something he ever wanted. He had always preferred a quiet life focused on service, discipline, and family. But now his name and face were tied to a moment that had started a conversation far bigger than himself. At the same time, in the local police department, tension filled every hallway. Reporters were still gathered outside the main building waiting for a statement. The chief of police was preparing for a press conference that was scheduled for later in the day. Inside, officers whispered to each other, wondering what would happen to their colleague. Some said he deserved the punishment coming his way, while others avoided talking about it altogether. The officer involved in the incident sat alone in a small office. His badge and weapon had already been taken, but the silence was what hurt the most. He replayed the night in his mind over and over. At first, he tried to tell himself he had done the right thing, that he had just been cautious. But the more he thought about it, the more the memory of the general's calm face and polite voice started to haunt him. The contrast between his anger and the general's composure felt unbearable. He switched on the television in the office and saw his own actions on the news. The video was being analyzed frame by frame. Reporters talked about the tone of his voice, the way he had shouted, the hand on his gun, and the lack of any reason for his behavior. For the first time, he truly saw himself from the outside, and what he saw didn't sit right. Across town at the military base, the general's co-workers were showing quiet support. Many of them came to see him personally. Some shook his hand, others simply offered a respectful nod. A few told him they were proud of how he handled the situation. One of his senior colleagues said softly, "You've shown everyone what real strength looks like, sir. Not every fight is fought with weapons." The general smiled faintly. "Thank you," he replied, "but this shouldn't have happened to anyone. I just hope it leads to something better." Meanwhile, preparations were underway for the police department's official press conference. The chief of police spent hours reviewing the investigation report and carefully choosing his words. He knew the public was watching closely and every sentence mattered. The city's reputation, the department's integrity, and the trust of the community all hung in the balance. When the time came, the chief stepped up to the podium. Cameras flashed, microphones filled the air, and reporters waited silently. The chief took a deep breath and began to speak. "Good afternoon. The incident involving one of our officers and an Army lieutenant general has been fully reviewed. After examining all available footage, reports, and witness statements, it is clear that the officer involved acted inappropriately and violated departmental policy. Effective immediately, he has been terminated from his position." There was a wave of murmurs from the reporters. The chief continued, "On behalf of our department, I offer a formal apology to the general and to the public. What happened does not reflect the values we stand for. We take accountability seriously, and this action is a step toward restoring the community's trust." Questions flew from every direction. Reporters asking about the investigation, about the officer's past record, about training and reform. The chief answered as best as he could, staying calm and professional. "We are reviewing our procedures," he said. "We will ensure every officer understands the importance of respect and restraint. Our responsibility is to protect, not intimidate." The press conference aired live on several news channels. At home, the general watched quietly from his living room. His family sat beside him, listening to every word. When the chief announced the dismissal, his wife gently placed her hand over his. "It's over now," she said softly. The general nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on the screen. "It's not over," he replied quietly. "It's just the beginning of a larger conversation." And he was right. As soon as the news broke, reactions poured in from across the country. Veterans, public figures, and ordinary citizens shared their thoughts. Some thanked the department for taking swift action. Others demanded deeper changes in training and accountability. Social media was filled with messages of support for the general, calling him a symbol of patience and dignity. That evening, the general received dozens of calls and emails from colleagues, community leaders, and even strangers. Many expressed admiration for his calmness. Some shared their own stories of being treated unfairly and said his experience gave them hope that things could change. He answered a few of the calls but avoided the ones that felt too emotional. He didn't want to become a celebrity or a headline. He just wanted people to learn from what happened. At the same time, the officer who had been dismissed packed up his few belongings from the police station. The air felt heavy as he walked down the hallway for the last time. A few officers looked away when he passed, while others gave short nods. No one spoke. Outside, he paused for a moment before getting into his car. For the first time in years, he felt unsure of what to do next. His career, something he had worked for since he was young, had ended in disgrace. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice told him that maybe this was his moment to change, to face what he had done and learn from it. Back at the general's home, dinner was quiet but peaceful. His children asked questions about what would happen next. "Are you going to do an interview, Dad?" One of them asked. He smiled. "No, I don't think so." "Sometimes silence says more than words, but aren't you angry?" Another asked. He looked at them thoughtfully. "Anger doesn't fix anything," he said. What matters is that people saw the truth and took action. That's enough for me. After dinner, he stepped outside again, standing under the stars just as he had the night of the incident. The same street looked so different now, quiet, calm, as if nothing had ever happened there. But he knew better. That street had become a symbol of something much larger: accountability, justice, and the power of remaining calm in the face of unfairness. He thought about all the soldiers he had trained over the years, all the lessons he had given about discipline and courage. In that moment, he realized that what he did during the traffic stop was just another form of courage, not the kind that comes from strength or rank, but from self-control. The next morning, a letter arrived at his home. It was from the mayor's office. Inside was a formal note expressing gratitude for how he had handled the situation with professionalism and restraint. The mayor wrote, "Your actions have reminded our community of the values we must uphold: respect, patience, and integrity. We thank you for setting that example." The general folded the letter carefully and placed it on his desk. He didn't need recognition, but it still meant something to him. It was proof that even a painful experience could lead to something meaningful. Days later, the general agreed to attend a community meeting organized by the city council. The meeting was held in a local hall, filled with people from different backgrounds. Reporters were not allowed. It was meant to be a conversation, not a spectacle. The general stood at the front of the room, speaking quietly but with sincerity. "What happened to me shouldn't have happened," he said. "But what matters now is how we move forward. Respect must go both ways, from citizens to officers and from officers to citizens. We must see each other as people first, not as labels or assumptions." The audience listened in silence. Some nodded, some wiped away tears. It wasn't just about one man's experience anymore. It was about what it represented. When the meeting ended, several people came up to thank him. One young man said, "Sir, you showed that calm doesn't mean weak. It means strong." The general smiled warmly and replied, "Exactly. Sometimes the hardest thing is staying calm when you have every reason not to." That night, as he drove home, the city lights shimmered in the distance. The world around him hadn't changed overnight, but a step forward had been taken. He knew there was still work to do, in training and understanding and empathy, but he also knew that change always begins with small moments of truth. He parked his car in the driveway and looked up at the sky once more. The stars were bright, steady, and silent, just like his resolve. The pain of that night would never fully disappear, but neither would the lesson it taught everyone who witnessed it. That calmness can be more powerful than anger, and truth always finds its way to the light. A few days passed, but the story was far from fading. What had started as a local issue had now become a national discussion. News channels still mentioned the Army Lieutenant General's name. Social media users continued to share clips, and people across the country debated about fairness, accountability, and respect. The town itself felt different, quieter, more cautious, as if everyone was suddenly more aware of how they treated others. The general, however, stayed grounded. He still went to work, greeted his colleagues with the same calm smile, and followed his daily routine. He had never been someone who sought attention, and now that the world was watching, he only wanted to make sure the attention led to something meaningful. One morning, he received a formal request from a national news station asking him to appear for an interview. They wanted to hear his side of the story. He thought about it carefully. He didn't want to sound angry or self-righteous. If he spoke, he wanted to say something that could help others think differently. After a night of reflection, he agreed. The interview was scheduled for the following day. The studio was simple: bright lights, clean chairs, and quiet cameras. The interviewer greeted him politely, and as they began, the first question was soft but direct. "General, the whole country has seen the video. You've remained calm throughout all of this. How did you manage to stay so composed in that moment?" He took a moment before answering. "Calmness doesn't mean you don't feel anything," he said softly. "I was angry. I was disappointed. But I knew if I lost my temper, the situation could get worse. I've seen what happens when emotion controls action. I wanted to make sure I didn't become part of the problem." The interviewer nodded. "Many people are calling you a hero for how you handled it." He shook his head slightly. "I don't see myself as a hero. I just tried to do what was right. Heroes are the ones who work every day to make things better for others. I hope this moment helps people see why respect and patience are important. on both sides. The interview aired that evening, and his words resonated deeply with viewers. Many appreciated his humility and emotional honesty. Instead of fueling division, his message encouraged understanding and reform. He spoke not as a victim, but as a teacher of values he had lived by his entire life. At the police department, things were changing too. The chief of police had started a new internal review process. Officers were required to attend additional training sessions focused on communication, community respect, and handling stressful situations without prejudice. The goal was to rebuild trust that had been shaken by one officer's actions. During one of those sessions, several younger officers discussed the incident openly. One of them said quietly, "It's strange how one person's mistake can make everyone else look bad." Another replied, "Yeah, but it also gives us a chance to prove we're better than that." "Maybe that's what we needed, a wake-up call." Their instructor nodded. "Mistakes can break trust, but how we respond to them shows who we really are." Meanwhile, the former officer who had been dismissed spent most of his days in silence. The world he once knew felt distant now. He avoided watching the news, but he couldn't escape it completely. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some stared, others whispered. He had become a symbol, but not in the way he ever wanted to be. One evening, he sat in his small apartment staring at the blank television screen. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It read simply, "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after them." He didn't know who had sent it, but those words stayed with him. Maybe this was his chance to change, not through excuses, but through real understanding. At the same time, the general's calm response continued to influence people across the country. Schools began discussing his story as an example of dignity under pressure. Some police academies even started using the incident as a case study for training. His actions were quietly helping shape the next generation of officers and citizens. A week later, the general received an invitation from a community organization that focused on strengthening relationships between police and civilians. They asked him to speak at an event meant to bring both sides together. He agreed, though he was careful not to turn it into a speech about blame. Instead, he wanted to focus on understanding. The event was held in a community hall packed with people: citizens, police officers, students, and local leaders. The room buzzed with anticipation as the general walked onto the stage. He looked out at the crowd and began speaking slowly in his calm and steady voice. "I've spent most of my life serving my country," he said. "I've learned that leadership isn't just about giving orders, it's about listening. Respect goes both ways. It's something you show even when it's not shown to you." The night of that traffic stop was difficult, but it reminded me that patience is not weakness. It's strength in disguise. He paused for a moment before continuing. "We all wear different uniforms. Some of us serve in the military, some in law enforcement, and some as civilians. But underneath all of that, we're people. The day we forget that, we lose the very thing that keeps our society together." The audience listened quietly. Some nodded. Some had tears in their eyes. Among them were several police officers who felt deeply moved. When the general finished, the room filled with applause, not loud or wild, but sincere and steady. After the event, a young officer approached him nervously. "Sir, I just wanted to thank you," the officer said. "What you said tonight, it made me think. I want to be better at my job, not just for me, but for the people I serve." The general smiled kindly. "That's where real change begins," he said. "In the heart of one person at a time." As weeks turned into months, the story began to settle, but its effects remained. The police department slowly started to regain trust. The chief made sure new policies were enforced strictly. Officers were encouraged to engage more with the community, to talk, to listen, to understand. The general continued his work quietly, never seeking recognition but always willing to help when called upon. One day he received a handwritten letter in the mail. It had no return address. Inside, it said, "I was the officer from that night. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that your calmness made me look at myself in a way I never had before. I've started volunteering at a community center, trying to make things right in my own way. Thank you for not meeting anger with anger." The general read the letter twice. He didn't know how to respond, but he didn't need to. The fact that the letter existed was enough. It meant that even the hardest hearts could change when met with patience instead of hate. Later that evening, he sat in his study, the letter still in his hands. His wife walked in quietly. "What's that?" she asked. He handed it to her. After reading it, she looked at him softly. "You see? You didn't just protect your dignity that night. You helped someone else find theirs." He nodded slowly. "Sometimes we don't realize the power of our actions until much later." As the days went by, the noise around the incident finally began to fade. The world moved on to other stories, other news. But for those who had witnessed the event, something lasting remained, a memory of what calm strength looked like, and a reminder that one person's composure can change the way others think. On a quiet afternoon, months later, the general stood near the same road where it had all begun. The air was peaceful and the sun cast a warm light across the pavement. Cars passed by as usual, unaware of the story that had unfolded there. He stood there for a moment, then smiled faintly and turned to leave. For him, it was never about revenge or recognition. It was about respect, something he believed every human being deserved, no matter their title, background, or appearance. And in his heart, he knew that through patience, truth had already done its work. Sometimes the most powerful battles are not fought with weapons or words, but with calmness and quiet courage. And though his story had started with confrontation, it had ended with understanding, proving that real strength lies not in force, but in grace. The news about the officer's dismissal had spread everywhere, and the community still buzzed with discussions about what had happened. For most people, the story had already served its purpose. It had shown that accountability was possible. But for those directly involved, the real work was just beginning. The police chief knew the department's reputation had taken a blow, and he was determined to rebuild it. Every morning, he gathered his team in the briefing room and reminded them of what was at stake. He didn't shout or blame. He spoke with quiet firmness. "We serve people," he told them. "When we forget that, we lose everything." Meanwhile, the Army Lieutenant General went back to his regular duties, though life didn't feel quite the same. He was still getting letters and messages from strangers, some thanking him, others sharing their own stories of being mistreated, but choosing calmness over conflict. He read each one carefully, often late at night when the world was quiet. One message came from a teacher who said she used his story as a lesson in her classroom. Another came from a young man who said he had once been angry at the world, but now wanted to join the police and do better than those before him. The general felt humbled. He never expected that a moment of restraint could ripple so far. Still, not everyone saw the situation the same way. Some people thought the officer deserved a second chance, while others believed his dismissal was not enough. The debates filled radio shows, television panels, and online forums. Through it all, the general remained silent. He believed that time, not arguments, revealed the truth. A few weeks later, the city council organized a public meeting to discuss community and police relations. Citizens, activists, and officers gathered in a large hall. The general was invited to attend, not as a speaker, but as an observer. He sat quietly near the back, listening to the voices of his neighbors. One woman stood up and said, "We need to feel safe, not judged. We shouldn't have to fear the people who are supposed to protect us." Her words drew applause. A few seats away, a young officer responded, "We feel the same pressure. Not all of us are like that officer. We want to do right, but we need your trust too." The discussion went on for hours, filled with emotion but also a surprising sense of hope. People weren't just complaining, they were listening. The general noticed that for the first time, it felt like both sides were willing to meet in the middle. After the meeting, a reporter approached him. "Sir?" she asked softly. "What do you think about all of this?" He smiled faintly. "I think people are learning," he said, "and that's more powerful than punishment." The next day, the general was invited to the police department for a private meeting. When he arrived, the chief greeted him warmly and led him into his office. On the desk lay a thick folder labeled Reform Plan. The chief spoke carefully. "We're changing things," he said. "Training, community involvement, accountability. I want your advice on how to make it real." The general studied the papers for a while, then looked up. "It starts with mindset," he said. "You can't teach respect from a book. You have to live it. The moment an officer forgets that they're dealing with a person, not a threat, that's when problems begin." The chief nodded slowly. "That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you. Over the next few weeks, the general quietly helped review training materials and attended a few sessions with new recruits. He never presented himself as a victim or a hero, just someone who wanted to help make things better. He shared lessons from his military experience about leadership, patience, and control. The recruits listened closely. For many of them, it was the first time they had heard such ideas spoken with calm authority rather than strict command. During one session, a young recruit asked, "Sir, what would you have done if the situation that night had gotten worse?" The general paused before answering. "I would have prayed for peace," he said simply, "because violence never fixes what understanding can." The room was silent for a moment before the instructor nodded and continued the class. At home, the general's family noticed that he seemed lighter somehow. The weight of what had happened was still there, but he had turned it into something meaningful. Instead of bitterness, he carried purpose. One evening, as he sat with his wife on the porch watching the sunset, she said quietly, "You know, you could have stayed angry. Most people would have, but you chose something different," he smiled. "Anger only burns you from the inside," he said. "If I held on to that, I'd be no better than the thing that caused it." Across town, the former officer was living a much quieter life. He had moved to a smaller city and was trying to find steady work. Every day felt like starting over. Sometimes he walked past police stations and wondered if they remembered him, if they talked about his name during training sessions as a warning. He didn't know if he deserved forgiveness, but he was beginning to understand what humility felt like. He had started attending community meetings, sitting in the back, listening more than talking. It wasn't about defending himself. It was about learning what he had never taken time to see before. The people he used to dismiss now looked him in the eyes and told their stories, and he listened. Slowly, quietly, he began to change. Back at the police department, the chief continued to push reforms. Officers were now required to participate in regular empathy workshops. They had to spend time in neighborhoods they patrolled, not just driving by, but walking, talking, shaking hands. At first, some resisted. "This isn't what we signed up for," one officer muttered. But after a few weeks, things began to shift. People started greeting them not with suspicion, but with cautious kindness. Trust was rebuilding, one small interaction at a time. One afternoon, the general was invited to a town event celebrating community unity. The mayor thanked him publicly, but he waved off the praise, reminding everyone that it wasn't about one man, it was about everyone choosing to be better. He said, "Change doesn't come from fear or anger. It comes from courage, the courage to admit we can do better." The crowd applauded, but his voice was calm, not proud. He wasn't giving a speech for fame. He was giving it for hope. A few days later, he received another letter. This one was from the same former officer who had written before. "I've started volunteering with youth programs," the letter said. "It's not much, but I want to help kids understand respect before they wear any kind of uniform. Thank you for showing me what that looks like." The general read the letter slowly, and for a long moment he just sat quietly, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. He didn't reply, but deep down he was grateful that the man was trying to make things right in his own way. It was proof that no one was beyond redemption if they truly wanted to change. As the months passed, the story that had once shaken the nation slowly faded from the headlines. But in the town where it all began, the changes were visible. The police department held open events where citizens could meet officers face to face. The city installed cameras at intersections, not just for safety, but as a reminder of transparency. The local schools even invited officers to speak to students about kindness and courage. And every once in a while, someone would recognize the general in a grocery store or park and quietly thank him for his example. He always smiled and said the same thing. It wasn't just me. We all learned something from that night. In time, the town became known not for the incident itself, but for how it grew afterward. It became a story of recovery, not just conflict. People moved on, but they moved on wiser, softer, more aware. And somewhere in that quiet progress, the general found peace. He had turned a painful moment into something that could inspire change, proving that respect and patience can outshine anger. His story reminded everyone that even in the darkest moments, light can come from doing the right thing, calmly, humbly, and with heart. Months had passed since the night that changed everything, but the lessons from it still lingered in the hearts of many. Life had slowly returned to normal for most people, Yet something inside the community had permanently shifted. There was a new kind of awareness, a quiet understanding that respect could not be demanded, only earned through actions. The Army Lieutenant General had gone back to his normal life, though nothing felt exactly the same. He no longer received as many letters or interview requests. The media had moved on and the noise had faded. But in that silence, something meaningful remained. When he walked through the town, people greeted him with gentle smiles. Some shook his hand and thanked him softly for showing the world that calmness could be stronger than anger. He didn't see himself as a hero or an example. He was just a man who had tried to do what was right in a difficult moment. Still, he could feel how his choices had quietly inspired others. Police officers who had once been defensive were now more mindful. Young people were more curious about what justice really meant. The world had not completely changed, but it had taken a step in the right direction. One sunny morning, the general received an invitation from the mayor's office. The town was planning an event to celebrate community unity and honor individuals who had contributed positively in the past year. At first, he hesitated to go. He never liked being in the spotlight. But then he thought about how many people had learned from his experience, and he decided it wasn't really about him. It was about the message. The event took place in the town square, filled with families, students, and local officials. Music played softly and the air was filled with the sound of laughter and conversation. When the general arrived, people greeted him warmly, some waving, others simply nodding in respect. The mayor stood at the podium and began speaking about the importance of unity, kindness, and responsibility. Sometimes, the mayor said, the most powerful change doesn't come from loud voices but from calm strength. One person's patience can teach a whole community how to be better. Then he turned toward the general and gestured for him to come up. The crowd clapped, not with excitement but with heartfelt appreciation. As the general walked to the stage, he felt a sense of peace. When he reached the microphone, he paused for a moment, looking at the faces in front of him. He spoke softly but clearly. "I've learned that life will test your patience in ways you never expect," he began. "Sometimes you'll be treated unfairly. Sometimes you'll face anger you don't deserve. But what matters most is how you respond, because your response can either make things worse or make things better. And if you choose calm, even in the storm, you can change more than you realize." The crowd listened quietly. He continued, "What happened to me was not something I would wish on anyone. But I don't hold anger in my heart. Anger destroys peace. What I hold on to instead is hope. Hope that we can learn to see each other not as enemies but as human beings." When he finished, the audience stood and applauded. Not loudly but with deep respect. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. The general stepped back from the microphone, nodded humbly, and took his seat. He didn't need awards or recognition. The simple act of being heard was enough. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed and the sun began to set, the general stood quietly under a tree, watching children run around the square. Their laughter reminded him that the future was always in motion, and every generation had the power to make it better. A few weeks after the event, something unexpected happened. The general received another letter, this one from the same former officer who had been dismissed. The handwriting was the same, but the tone felt different, calmer, more thoughtful. The letter read, "I've continued my volunteer work with the community center. Every day I meet young people who remind me of what I lost and what I took for granted. I've learned more about respect in these months than I did in all my years on the job. I can't undo what I did, but I can choose what I do from now on. Thank you for being the kind of person who made me face myself." The general sat quietly for a while after reading it. He didn't feel pride or satisfaction, just quiet understanding. Sometimes forgiveness wasn't spoken out loud. It was lived through change. He didn't know if he would ever see that man again, but he hoped the letter meant something real. As time passed, the general found himself invited to speak at universities and leadership programs. He never spoke about blame or anger. Instead, he focused on self-control, respect, and empathy. Strength, he would say, isn't measured by how loud you are or how hard you fight. It's measured by how much peace you can keep inside when everything around you is trying to shake it. His words resonated with students and officers alike. One afternoon, he received a call from the police chief. The chief wanted to personally thank him again and invited him to a training session for new recruits. "We've made your story a part of our ethics program," the chief said. "Not to embarrass anyone, but to remind them that one wrong moment can change everything, and one right choice can save it." The general agreed to attend. When he arrived, he was surprised to see a large group of young officers sitting attentively. The chief introduced him and he walked to the front of the room, feeling both humble and hopeful. He spoke simply, not as a lecturer, but as a human being sharing experience. "You will face difficult moments," he said. "People will test your patience. Some will insult you. Some will fear you. But remember, your uniform doesn't make you powerful. Your behavior does. Every time you choose respect over pride, you protect not only others but yourself." Afterward, one of the recruits came up and said, "Sir, I think I understand now. It's not about control over others, it's about control over yourself." The general smiled and nodded. "That's the lesson I learned the hard way," he replied. As the years went by, that lesson continued to spread. The story of that night, how an officer lost his temper and a man chose patience, became more than just an incident. It became a teaching tool, a reminder of what humanity looks like when tested. Eventually, the general retired from active service. He spent his days quietly at home, gardening, reading, and enjoying the peace he had worked so hard to maintain. He still received occasional letters from people who had heard his story. Each one carried the same message: gratitude for showing what calm strength could achieve. One afternoon, while sitting on his porch, he thought back to that night. The flashing lights, the shouted words, the tension in the air, it all felt like a lifetime ago. What had once been a painful memory had turned into a life lesson for thousands. He realized that sometimes the hardest moments in life are not meant to break you, but to teach you who you really are. His wife joined him on the porch, handing him a cup of tea. "You know," she said softly, "the world could use more stories like yours, ones that remind people of decency." He smiled. "Maybe the world already has them," he said. "They just don't always make the news." The sky began to turn orange as the sun dipped low. Birds flew home and the air felt calm. The general leaned back in his chair, a small smile on his face. He didn't need recognition or fame. His peace came from knowing that even one act of patience could plant a seed of change in others. As the evening breeze passed through the trees, he thought about the journey, from the night of confrontation to this moment of quiet. It had been painful, but it had meaning, and in that meaning he found purpose. The story that had once been about anger had become a story about growth. The people involved had changed, the town had changed, and even those who watched from afar had learned something about compassion and control. In the end, that was the real victory. Not the headlines, not the applause, but the silent change that happens when people choose to be better. And as darkness gently settled over the town, the general sat peacefully, content in the knowledge that patience, kindness, and integrity would always outshine fear and hate. Because in a world full of noise and division, sometimes all it takes is one calm voice to remind everyone what humanity truly looks like.